The movie begins with an elderly woman named Helga, who has dementia and loves knitting while quietly watching TV. Suddenly, a noise from the vent startles her, so she calls an exterminator. When he asks for her name and address, she has to read them off slips of paper because of her memory troubles. Before long, Exterminator Frank arrives. As he gets close to Helga's apartment, he notices a foul-smelling liquid seeping from the vent and hears a strange noise. Helga opens the door but seems to forget why she called him and what the noise was. When Frank hears the noise again, she lets him in to investigate. Inside, Frank follows a trail of blood that leads him to another exterminator, injured and bleeding in the vent. Suddenly, a loud noise startles Frank and he turns around only to scream as something leaps at him. Helga hears Frank scream and sees him trying to crawl out, but he's quickly dragged back in. Her memory quickly erases what she saw, and she returns to her knitting and TV. When she hears yet another strange noise, she decides to call a different exterminator. We then flash back to 4 days earlier, when a fiery ball hurtles from space and crashes in New York inside a toy house. It turns out to be an egg, and soon a small spider emerges from it. Meanwhile, Helga's granddaughter Charlotte sneaks into a storeroom to grab a doll for an Instagram post. As she reaches for the doll, she notices a spider on her hand. She quickly hides it in an empty matchbox when she hears someone coming and escapes through the vent. Helga's sister Gunter enters the room, notices a hole in the window, and quickly leaves in a hurry. Charlotte sneaks back through the vent and overhears Gunter scolding her stepfather Ethan, accusing her of breaking into the storeroom. Furious, Ethan decides to confront Charlotte. Charlotte rushes to her room and puts the spider in a jar. When Ethan asks if she was in Gunter's apartment, Charlotte lies and denies it. Their relationship is clearly tense. Ethan tells her to stay away from Gunter, but he's interrupted by a call from Sandy at the publishing house about his comic book. Charlotte names the spider Sting, snaps a photo, and posts it on Instagram. Her mom, Heather, then asks her to watch her little brother Liam while she works. Bored, Charlotte decides to check on Sting. Ethan, a comic book artist and part-time building supervisor, is fixing pipes in a neighbor's apartment when a cockroach lands on his face, making him jump. The apartment owner, Maria, thanks him for his work. A widow who lost her 2 sons, she reminds Ethan to appreciate his family. While Charlotte feeds Sting a cockroach, Ethan finishes work and heads home to look after baby Liam. Meanwhile, Heather checks on her mom, Helga, who's watching TV with Gunter. Helga proudly tells Heather that she made Charlotte a sweater with a moth pattern. With her memory affected by dementia, she even suggests Heather should meet her own daughter. Later, Ethan works on his comic book and tries to bond with Charlotte, showing her a character inspired by her father. They share a nice moment, but Heather interrupts, asking Charlotte to set the table and thanking Ethan for being so kind to her. Later, Ethan goes to tuck Charlotte in, but she's not in her room. He spots a drawing of a giant spider and notices a jar holding Sting. Before he can look at the spider, Charlotte returns, and he says,
"Good night."
As she sleeps, Sting slips out of the jar and creeps into the vent. Gunter's parrot spots Sting and tries to alert Gunter. The next morning at breakfast, Charlotte tries to talk to Ethan and Heather, but they're both busy discussing work. Frustrated, Charlotte leaves the table. Ethan asks Heather when she plans to tell Charlotte that her dad has been back in town for 6 months but hasn't visited her. Heather promises she'll tell Charlotte when the time feels right and asks him to check on Liam. As the family continues with their routines, they hear a scream from Gunter's apartment. Ethan rushes upstairs and finds Gunter's parrot has been killed, skinned, and pinned to the cage. Gunter insists he call Frank, the exterminator. Frank investigates and figures that whatever killed the parrot is small and came through the vent, so he decides to smoke out the building to get rid of it. Meanwhile, Charlotte brings a bag of cockroaches to feed Sting, who mimics her whistle to signal he's hungry. When a mothball rolls near the jar, Sting panics until Charlotte moves it away. Mothballs can dissolve Sting's web, making them his biggest weakness. Charlotte notices Sting has grown bigger, which she finds thrilling. After Frank smokes the building, he's about to spray Charlotte's room, but she stops him, not wanting to harm her spider. Frank suggests she get a dog instead, saying spiders only know how to eat and kill. That night, Maria dozes off watching TV, but her dog senses something in the vent and starts barking, waking her up. Irritated, she shoos the dog away and goes to take her medicine, unaware that Sting is closing in. As she gazes at a photo of her late husband and sons, Sting lunges at her, stinging her on the cheek and causing her to fall and hit her head. Maria rushes to the bathroom after the sting, Noticing her cheek is swelling and turning purple, she starts to feel nauseous, then vomits and collapses, hitting her head on the edge of the bathtub. Paralyzed except for her eyes, Maria watches helplessly as Sting crawls toward her and into her mouth, finishing her off. Meanwhile, as Sting keeps growing, Charlotte visits Eric, a biology student who does experiments on animals, to borrow a fish tank. She shows Eric her pet spider, Sting, and when she whistles, Sting surprisingly mimics her, leaving Eric stunned. He points out that spiders don't have vocal cords, so Sting is far from ordinary. Charlotte then feeds Sting a cockroach, impressing Eric even more. Eric suggests keeping Sting for a while, saying he'll need a secure tank to make sure Sting can't escape. Charlotte agrees, but makes him swear to keep Ethan in the dark about the arrangement. Elsewhere, Heather and Ethan are in the middle of an argument when a noise comes from the vent. Ethan decides to check it out, but a sudden movement startles him, causing him to fall, only to discover it's Maria's dog. Ethan returns the dog by knocking on Maria's door, but when she doesn't answer, he uses a skeleton key to enter and finds her body. He calls the police to report it, only to be interrupted by an urgent call from Eric. At Eric's apartment, Ethan learns just how venomous Sting is. Eric warns him that Sting could be lethal, and suggests calling the Department of Health and Safety, as Sting's size and danger make him a serious threat. When Eric shows just how massive Sting has become, Ethan is genuinely alarmed. Back home, Ethan confronts Charlotte about keeping such a dangerous spider as a pet. Angry, Charlotte storms off to Eric's apartment to take Sting back, but he ignores her. In frustration, she lashes out at Ethan, criticizing his comic book for killing off her favorite character, who is based on her dad. Assuming her dad is in Thailand, she tells Ethan her real father is way better than him. This triggers Ethan to tell her the truth. Her father has actually been back in town for 6 months but hasn't come to see her. Heartbroken, Charlotte runs to her room, and Heather scolds Ethan for crushing Charlotte's view of her father and damaging her self-confidence, reminding him it wasn't his news to share. Instead of handing Sting over to the Department of Health and Safety, Eric decides to keep him, feeding him larger animals to see how much he'll grow. That night, as Eric sleeps, Sting grows so large he breaks free from the fish tank. Meanwhile, Ethan is fixing a heater when he gets a voicemail from Sandy at the publishing house, telling him his comic book isn't working out. Frustrated, he snaps and takes his anger out on the heater. Gunter walks in and criticizes him for being careless, warning she'll fire him by the end of the month. When Ethan asks why she's so harsh, Gunter accuses him of being weak and vows to keep him away from her niece, leaving Ethan feeling defeated. Returning to her apartment, Gunter calls for her cat but gets no response. While watching TV with her sister, she hears the cat's meows coming from the vent. Curious, she crawls inside with a flashlight, which suddenly goes out. At that moment, Sting lunges at her, dragging her deeper into the vent. Time passes, and Ethan's frustration with his life only grows. While fixing a TV cable, he accidentally shocks himself, then loses his temper and slams the screen, scaring the children. Heather asks Charlotte to take her brother to another room while she confronts Ethan about his behavior. With headphones on, Charlotte watches videos on her phone while her mom and stepdad argue in the other room. Suddenly, Sting attacks her parents, paralyzing them and dragging them away. Unaware, Charlotte assumes Maria's dog is hungry when it starts barking, so she goes to the kitchen to get some food, completely oblivious, as Sting drags her stepfather toward the vent. As the dog continues barking, Charlotte finally notices her mom and stepdad aren't around and starts searching the apartment. She panics when she sees the open vent and realizes that Sting is pulling her stepfather inside. Unaware of what's happened, Charlotte tries to reach out for help, only to realize there's no internet. Panicking, she attempts to leave the apartment, but the windows and door are locked, and even the dog has vanished. Realizing this is Sting's doing, she blocks the open vent, hoping it'll keep Sting from coming after her. But Sting sneaks up from behind, grabs her baby brother Liam, and escapes through another vent. Charlotte screams, devastated as she watches Sting take her brother. Desperate to get Liam back, she begins to regret ever bringing Sting into her home and knows she has no choice but to face him. Charlotte puts on the moth sweater her grandmother knitted, grabs her water gun, and fills it with mothball water, since mothballs are Sting's weakness. Charlotte heads to Eric's apartment for help, only to find him tied up and hanging from the ceiling, tangled in Sting's web. She quickly checks on her grandmother, warning her to keep her moth shawl on for protection. Finding a stash of mothballs in Helga's apartment, Charlotte makes more moth water and douses herself with it before going out to confront Sting. Hearing Ethan screams as he struggles in Sting's web, she follows the sound and frees him. At the same time, Exterminator Frank arrives in response to Helga's call about the strange noises. Just as Ethan is about to exit the vent, he hears Liam's voice nearby. Charlotte urges him to stay calm, but suddenly Sting lunges at them, and they both fall into the basement dumpster. Charlotte briefly loses consciousness, but wakes to see Sting towering over her. Ethan intervenes just in time, driving Sting away with the mothball water. Charlotte breaks down, guilt-ridden for keeping Sting as a pet and realizing the danger she's brought on everyone. Ethan reassures her, telling her it's not her fault and that they'll find a way to get through this together. Suddenly, Frank is thrown into the garbage room by Sting. Furious, he yells at Charlotte for keeping such a dangerous spider as a pet and tries to open the back door to escape, but it's locked. In a panic, Frank attacks Ethan, demanding the key, but all Ethan has is the bottle of mothball water, their only weapon against Sting. Frank grabs the bottle, pours some on himself, and arms himself with a nail gun, determined to face Sting. As Sting breaks through the vent, Frank panics and fires wildly, missing Sting and accidentally hitting the sprinkler system. The sprinklers activate, washing away the protective mothball water on Ethan, Charlotte, and Frank, leaving them defenseless against Sting. In a flash, Sting shoots his web, pulling Frank into the vent and killing him gruesomely, horrifying Ethan and Charlotte. The two retreat to the garbage compactor, where they find Heather and Liam tied up in Sting's web. Ethan uses the remaining moth water to melt the web, freeing them. He hugs his wife and son, and Charlotte joins in, realizing just how much her family means to her. But then Sting reappears, advancing toward them. Ethan tries to shut the compactor door to crush Sting, but it won't move. It's unplugged. As he reaches for the plug, Charlotte steps forward to hold Sting off. Sting knocks Charlotte aside, preparing to strike the family. At the last second, Ethan manages to plug in the compactor, but is electrocuted and loses consciousness. Charlotte rushes to hit the button, closing the compactor door and crushing Sting, ending his reign of terror. Heather drags Ethan out of the compactor and desperately tries to revive him. Charlotte closes her eyes, counting under her breath. 1, 2, 3. And then Ethan stirs, coming back to life. Charlotte calls him Dad, says she loves him, and hugs him tightly. The family, having survived this harrowing ordeal, embraces warmly, grateful to be together. But just out of sight, a pile of spider eggs sits ready to hatch.